Welcome back to Echo Ridge and the start of another wonderful series. This one is going to be our ultimate beginner's guide to Oxygen Not Included. As such, I wanted to give you a warning. This guide is primarily intended for the absolute beginner. We'll be going very slow and methodically over most aspects of the game and the different strategies we go through to employ them. That's not to say that the advanced or expert level player won't be able to learn a thing or two, but the pacing of this series is going to be quite a bit different than my standard playthroughs. Without further ado, let's get going. When you launch the game, it's going to look sort of like this if you're using the Spaced Out DLC. If you're not using the Spaced Out DLC, it's going to look more like this. But if you have the DLC and you want to get back to playing using the DLC, you just hit this button. Now in this series, we will be using the DLC, but if you don't own it, do not fret. Most of the mechanics found in the DLC are going to be the same as found in vanilla, with few exceptions. The DLC adds, namely, the addition of radiation, a few more critters and plant life. Additionally, the ability to be able to get off your starting planetoid and travel to other planetoids. But if you're a vanilla-only player, or have yet to purchase the DLC, do not worry, you're still going to be able to learn a lot from watching this series. There's a few items that I wanted to point out in the main menu. We have our standard new game and load game, but we also have a colony summaries. In this screen, you'll be able to see all the achievements that you've earned, and a history of all the colonies that you have played. If you click on any of the colonies, you're going to be able to see a detail of what happened during that playthrough, complete with what achievements you were able to accomplish. One fun little feature is the ability to watch a time lapse of what the colony looked like from the time that you started it to the time that you finished. Next up is a relatively new feature to Oxygen Not Included, and that's the supply closet. 3 times a week, Clay, the developer of Oxygen Not Included, is just going to give you a gift. They'll appear in-game, and when you click on them, you'll unlock a blueprint. Now, the blueprint doesn't necessarily add or subtract to your gameplay. It literally just changes the skin on different buildings you can use inside the game. Everything from new flower pots and beds, to different pieces of artwork, to even wonderful new clothes that you can put your duplicate in. The game comes with a few extra translations, and then we have our mod panel. While I do use a couple of mods, and you can find that list in the description of this video, I don't use any mods that would alter the playthrough of the game. They're mostly to improve your experience watching this video, or my experience in creating them. Then we have an options menu, and it is pretty standard fare, although there are a couple of features that I wanted to point out. The first one is in the graphics menu, where it gives you the ability to adjust the UI scale. There is a lot of text and data on your screen, so this is where you would go to change the size of some of that data. Additionally, if you are running on a potato, it might be helpful to adjust the resolution down and click low resolution textures. Next, under game options, you can adjust the temperature units. I and many others play using the Celsius temperature unit. For me, it's because the majority of the world uses it, including the American scientific community. And lastly, in the options, there's the controls. Now, I know controls in a game is nothing new, except most people don't really click on them unless they're trying to change a hotkey. But in these menus, you can actually find some additional functionality in the game that you may have not even known about. For instance, the ability to hit H to bring the camera right back to your printing pod, or the ability to hold left shift or right shift to be able to draw things in a straight line without your mouse going up and down and ruining your perfectly placed floors. Also, another fun feature is the ability to set user viewpoints. For instance, if you set a location on your map with Control 1, you'll be able to recall right to that point with Shift 1. Now that we've gone over some of those foundational items, let's go ahead and start a new game. When you start a new game, you're going to be given 2 options, survival and no sweat, and they're pretty self-explanatory. Survival is just more difficult, whereas with no sweat, the duplicants will be less prone to disease, Their morale will be easier to maintain, they can go longer without eating, and stress is typically not a problem for them. I would say the majority of people typically do play survival, and so we're going to use it and the standard settings that go along with it, so my gameplay experience is going to be mostly similar to your gameplay experience. The next up is the asteroid style, and this is going to flip some people up. There's two styles, classic and spaced out. Because of the naming structure, some folks believe that playing classic means you're not going to be playing with the DLC, whereas playing the spaced out asteroid style is playing with the DLC, and this is not the case. In the classic style of play, your asteroid is going to be much larger in a similar way than when you were playing in vanilla, but you will still have an opportunity to leave that planetoid and go to other smaller planetoids. Whereas in spaced out, your starting asteroid is sort of smaller, and there's a lot more planetoids to discover in the star map. We're going to be using the spaced out style, so I can emphasize what I believe most people will encounter on their first playthrough. Next up is a lot to unpack, so make sure you have a cold drink ready and a relaxing sitting position. In Oxygen Not Included, there is no starting world. It mostly has a sort of sandbox presentation. With that being said, most people probably consider this first cluster to be the most basic and entry-level start. And even down in the description of the cluster, it says the survival chance is ideal. Whereas if we start navigating to the right, you'll notice that the survival chances get lower and lower, with the very far right being a slim chance of survival. Also, in the description, you'll be able to see all the asteroids that are going to be available for you in this playthrough. This first one, aptly named the starting asteroid, is where you will start with your initial dupes. On the right, it shows you all the asteroid's modifications. Notice this first asteroid that it shows, with metallic caves and crashed satellites, is not the first asteroid in the list. Rather, it is the first asteroid in the list with the modifications that are also represented by use of these little icons. Now, we're not going to go into what each modification means, but I highly invite you, before you start a map, to highlight over each of them, because it'll explain to you what each individual world trait does. In the case of metal caves, it means the world has more metal ore. Crashed satellites, you guessed it, there's some radioactive crashed satellites on that asteroid. To highlight an earlier point, where I called this the cluster, I want to be able to show you what a classic cluster looks like. Notice there are just a lot fewer asteroids inside the star map. And since I've caught myself saying it already, I use the terms planetoid and asteroid interchangeably, so please pardon the occasional verbal slip. Additionally, if we go all the way back and deactivate the DLC and start a new game from vanilla ONI, you can see it doesn't say anything about clusters. It's just your one starting asteroid. And as you move over to the right, they get more difficult. They also have their own world traits, but there are no other asteroids you're going to be able to travel to, at least in the traditional sense that you'll be able to in the spaced out DLC. Next up on our cluster selection screen is the story traits tab. Clay has started adding different story traits that will add to your playthrough, and I highly recommend that you keep all 4 of these checked until you're ready for a more customizable experience. They don't detract from the gameplay and only change some of the things that you're able to do and accomplish throughout your playthrough. We'll eventually describe what each of these does, but here at the beginning, no, just to keep all 4 of these checked. Finally is the Game Settings button. Here is where you can adjust some of the difficulty and features of your playthrough. First is the World Gen Seed. Keep an eye on this, because I'm going to discuss this a little bit more in the future. You have the hunger settings for your duplicants, which makes them either really hungry or not very hungry at all, with tummyless meaning they don't actually need to eat, and ravenous means they eat twice as much. Durability, adjust how quickly your suits that the duplicants will wear out, everything from threadbare, where the suits wear out pretty quickly, down to indestructible, where the suits won't ever have to be repaired. Then we have the radiation settings that go from critical mass, which means the duplicants have a hard time with radiation, down to nuclear proof, where the duplicants don't care about radiation at all. Disease, once again, just like the others, from outbreak prone, where they can get sick pretty quickly, to total immunity. Morale, from draconian, where they're very stringent and demanding of their needs, all the way down to the point where morale will not impact the duplicant's stress. Speaking of stress, we're going to go to it next, because you can adjust it independently too, where the duplicants stress out either easily or not at all. The next up is meteor showers. I would say that the meteor showers do impact difficulty, but not in the same sort of way. All of these impacted the duplicants themselves. Meteor showers impacts the environment, with doomsday level of meteor showers impacting your planetoid all the way down to clear skies, and there is no meteor damage. Finally, we have some toggles. The first one being whether or not the duplicants will invoke their stress reaction when they stress out, whether or not the printing pod will give you a care package along with duplicant choices. Then you have the option to save to the cloud or to keep it a local save. Start the game in sandbox mode, which is sort of a freebie mode where you can build anything at will. Be forewarned though, this will disable your achievements. And then teleporters. This option here is also only available in the Spaced Out DLC, just like the radiation, because it allows your starting world to have a teleporter to get from your first asteroid over to your second asteroid and back. We're going to keep everything default and then head back to our destination screen. Do you see this number right here in the middle? It's the same number as your World Gen Seed. As we change it, the World Gen Seed over here changes as well. But when sharing playthroughs, most people will share the entire coordinates, because this is what changes not only the seed of what this specific world is going to appear like, but also all the options you've selected. For instance, notice the C3 here, but if I go and turn off Somnium Synthesizer, it changes it to a 93. Turning off Critter Fluxomatic, 03. Also, changing the planetoid selection will adjust the first 4 letters, highlighting which cluster it is. With that being said, if you hit the rerolled world seed, it's only going to change the seed itself, but all of these settings are still going to stay the same. Without further ado and at long last, let's go ahead and finally click the Start Game button. Once you get Start Game, you're going to be brought to this screen where they're going to be trying to build that seed that you selected. Occasionally, you will encounter a seed that just doesn't work, and you'll be brought back to the destination screen. Otherwise, you'll be brought to the duplicant selection screen. These are the 3 duplicants that you will start with. A duplicant is just one of these little fellas. We normally call them dupes. To that point, the reason why they're called duplicants is because this is not Nisbet. This is not Devon. This is actually a Nisbet. In other words, you can have more than one Nisbet on your colony. Although, if you continuously re-roll all these duplicants, you won't see a Nisbet appear, or an Ashcan in this case, at the starting screen. But in the future, the printing pod would give you a Nisbet, although they'll have different interests. The only thing that would be the same for instance, this Amari, is all Amaris have the same stress reaction, in this case Banshee, and overjoyed response, in this case super productive, even when the interests changed. Let's see if I can get another Amari. Here's another Amari that only has an interest in cooking, except notice there's still a Banshee and they're still super productive. Now we're going to discuss a little bit of strategy on your starting duplicates, but we're going to learn more about individual interests and traits as we go through the tutorial. Some of the ones I want you to be careful with from the start though. Stay away from bottomless stomach, at least in your first few playthroughs, because notice bottomless stomach means Ashcan is going to need to eat more, which is intrinsically making the game a little bit more difficult. Also be careful of duplicates that say they cannot do something. For instance, this Hassan here is a yokel and cannot do researching errands. So if you just happen to have 3 duplicants that all can't do researching, you're going to be pretty hamstrung until you get another duplicate. The last one I want you to be careful with is mouth breather, because they have increased air consumption. And remember, the title of the game is Oxygen Not Included, so duplicants that require more oxygen is once again going to make it more difficult on you. Now in this screen, along with just clicking reroll until you see another duplicate that you like, you can click this drop down menu here and decide exactly what this duplicate should specialize in. In this case, we're going to make this first one a digger, which means they're always going to have an interest in digging, which is going to help you out in the early game when you're trying to dig through that starting planetoid. This brings up another trait that I want you to be wary of, and that is the flatulent trait. It might not be a big deal, but if you're going a little slower and Steve here keeps outputting natural gas, well, duplicants can't breathe natural gas, so it might sort of gum up the works. So we're going to take this Catalina here that is not only good at digging with a +2 to excavation, but they're also good at tidying and building. Now, they are a glow stick, which means they naturally exude a little bit of radiation. We'll get into that a lot more later. And finally, they have allergies, so they'll go into little sneezy fits whenever they're around plants that have a floral scent. Next up, we want to make sure we select a researcher. Researching is important in this game. It allows you to keep driving up that tech tree and unlocking new buildings and technologies. This pay here starts with a monstrous +10 to science, has early bird, we'll go over schedules more later, which means they'll get a bonus to all their attributes during the daytime. Their negative is building impaired, which means they're not so good at building things. The last dupe, I'm going to invite you to get creative. Some folks like to use another digger to start off with, although I don't believe it's necessary, especially with the smaller asteroid sizes in spaced out. Some people like to start with a cook. That way they have a duplicate that can specialize and use the electric grill right from the start. Another popular choice is to have a specialized rancher, and that way they can get into ranching critters as soon as possible. And that is what we're going to choose. Except the rancher that we're going to be looking for is also going to be good at farming, because farming and ranching are 2 popular ways to make food. After a fair bit of rerolling, we found a Bubbles who starts with +1 to husbandry, +1 to agriculture. They even don't mind doing a little supplying. Who's starry-eyed, which means they get bonuses while they're in space. Not very helpful considering your ranchers and farmers are typically not in space. And they are gastrophobic, which means they will refuse to do any sort of cooking errands. We'll change the name of the colony to the University of ONI, and then click the Embark button. Now, because that world seed was already rolled, you'll instantly be brought to your starting planetoid. Now, before you get click happy, don't just click begin. I invite you to read all the messages. This is fairly important skill in Oxygen Not Included. This isn't a game where you want to rush through. In fact, I want you to go very slow, especially in your first few playthroughs. The one thing I wanted to point out in this alert is it says, I've detected a new cluster of material-rich planetoids in nearby space. If I can guide the duplicates through the perils of space travel, we could build a colony even bigger and better than before. The emphasis on the word I. That's right, because you are this printing pod right here. That is you playing this game. You're who controls the duplicates, tells them what to do, and teaches them new things. Now you'll notice that I paused as soon as we clicked that alert message. And this is sort of where we're going to stay for quite a bit of time, because we have a lot to learn just in this screen. And I recommend you do the same thing on the start of every single one of your playthroughs, because there is already a lot of strategy that goes into what little bit you can see from your new vantage point. The first thing we're going to learn is about tiles. Notice this tile has 700 kilograms of sandstone in it. In the tooltip, it says that it's a raw mineral and its temperature is 21.9 degrees Celsius, which is good. That's a fairly decent temperature for us. When you click on this tile, a much more detailed description will pop up, to include showing if it has any surface germs, information about sandstone, what its melting point, its hardness is, also its specific heat capacity, thermal conductivity, radiation absorption factor, and some of its intrinsic properties. We'll get into a lot more of these later. I just wanted to make sure you knew, like I said before, there is a lot to read here. In fact, you could spend an hour just learning the differences between, say, sandstone, this weird looking oxalite stuff, dirt, and sand, all without ever unpausing the game. Yes, it's one of those types of games. Also on our sandstone panel, we have the germs overlay. If there were any germs on this tile, it would give you a description of what they were, and the properties. Now, most of these properties were also available on the general status screen down here. Another button I wanted to highlight to you, though, is this one right here. The game comes with a database. You click the button, and the database opens, where once again, you can start learning. It is a literal encyclopedia of knowledge, and you will be able to learn so much from clicking through this database. The database has a wonderful search feature. For instance, if we wanted to look up sand, and then we can go to its entry and learn all about it. We can go back to our sandstone by clicking the back button. We can also see what the additional states are in our database entry, to include what happens when the sandstone heats up beyond 926 degrees. In this case, it turns into a liquid called magma, where we can easily click on magma, and we can find out what happens to magma when it's heated up, for instance, to past 2356 degrees, it turns into rock gas. And this is sort of a large rabbit hole you could end up in. But during your first few playthroughs, don't worry too much about trying to learn everything there is about every single material and their transition points, because quite frankly, this is not going to be the only colony you're going to play, which brings up another point. Your colony is going to fail. You are going to fail. But that's sort of the great thing about Oxygen Not Included, because we can just start a new game, except this time with a little bit more experience. The next thing I want you to click on is the duplicates themselves. When we highlight over pay, it brings up a tooltip. Notice they're inhaling 100 grams of oxygen per second. That's just how much they breathe. When they first come through the pod, it's gonna say 85 grams per second. I don't know why, but after a quick pause and unpause, they go back to breathing 100 grams per second. They're also exhaling 2,000 milligrams per second, which is just a more complicated way of saying 2 grams per second of carbon dioxide. They're also currently getting the early bird buff, because remember, Pei likes the morning time, and they also have the New Hope buff. When we click on Pei, we get the same sort of descriptive panel we got when we clicked on the tile, where we can highlight over some of these things, such as the early bird. This Pei is getting +2 to all their attributes because it's the morning time, and because this is a new colony, we're getting New Hope, which means they're starting with +1 to morale, -20% per cycle to stress, and that buff is going to last for 3 cycles. All your buffs and debuffs will appear in this status pane. You can minimize and expand these status screens. We can also rename Pei. Pei unfortunately does not have a database entry, but we can also change Pei's outfit using that supply closet that we showed you at the beginning of the game by going to Restyle Outfit or Open Wardrobe. Take a note though that if we change Pei's outfit to be a basic bubblegum shirt, it's not actually going to impact anything in the game. I say that because in the future there will be clothes that we can put them in that will apply some modification effects. Continuously using Pei as our example, notice they also have a condition pane that shows how much health they have, what their current stress is, and what their current morale is. I do want you to spend quite a bit of time looking at these stress panels and morale panels as you're learning the game, because it's going to show you different things that are impacting them on a cycle-to-cycle basis. For instance, under stress, you can see that this pay has a high morale, and they currently have the New Hope buff, which means their stress is changing by minus 40% per cycle. And this is good, which means they're losing stress. If they were gaining stress, we could end up triggering their stress response. In this case, pay is a banshee, which means they're going to wail uncontrollably when they're stressed out. On the morale side, when they have a significantly high morale, they're going to trigger their overjoyed response. In this case, pay is a balloon artist, which means they're going to hand out balloons all over the colony, which will give your duplicants a buff whenever they're holding their balloon. Some of the other points on the condition panel are their bladder, indicates when they're ready to go to the bathroom. Right now, pay's bladder is 7% full, and when it gets to be 100%, if they don't have a bathroom to go in, they're going to end up peeing their pants. This is how much breath they have remaining, how much stamina they have, which they will slowly lose every single cycle, and regain when they go to sleep at night, and their calories. Duplicants eat 1,000 calories per cycle. This pay currently has 3,537 calories. So, you know that this duplicant would starve to death in about 3.5 cycles if they weren't given anything else to eat. Finally, you can see their body temperature. It says a healthy duplicant's body temperature is 37°C. Of note, over 70 degrees, and they'll start getting scalded. Also, if they get too cold, there's a chance they'll contract hypothermia. Finally is the decor. We'll get into a little bit more on that later, but just know this is how attractive the environment is to be around, which sort of represents the difference of being in a pleasant garden versus, say, a loud, smelly factory. And then finally, their absorbed rad dose. Right now, they have 0.8 rads. Mostly because if you remember, our Catalina here has glow stick, which is not too big of a deal because duplicants are able to get rid of radiation every time they go to the bathroom or by taking medicine. But if they get too much radiation, they'll end up getting radiation sickness. We'll go over more on that later. Finally, we have a pane that'll show whatever pay is carrying and a more detailed description on what kind of stress pay is going through. Also, we can click a button that says Show Navigation, which shows where it is possible for pay to go to right now. We can also force pay to move by clicking the Move Here button and then unpausing the game. And then lastly is a follow cam, which will do a couple of things. Whenever pay moves, your camera will move along with pay, but also when you're watching pay, they get the center of attention buff, which comes with a minus 5% stress per cycle. Next up, we have a few tabs. The About, which says their name, how old they are, what and if they have a gender, a fun little description of what pays are all about, and then it'll also show their interests. Remember, these are the interests that we picked at the beginning. Pay here is our researcher. Lower on the bio pane is all their traits. Remember the traits of building impaired and early bird that Pay have? It also shows that they're a banshee and a balloon artist. The one I want you to pay attention to most right now is the duplicant trait, because when you highlight over it, it will give you a lot of information about what it is just to be a duplicant. This is another one of those information-heavy panes that you may want to refer to and learn a little bit at a time. Finally, we have the pane that shows all their learned skills, all of the attributes that they have. Notice that Pay here has a 12 to science because they started with a plus 10 to science, but they also have plus 2 to a lot of their attributes because they're an early bird. Here's their germs pane that shows their general resistance to germs. And then lastly is the properties pane. Just like on the sandstone, there are a lot of properties in here, some of which you saw by highlighting over the duplicant trait underneath the bio. Of special note, notice the duplicant is made out of genetic ooze. This Pay is not a human being as we would think of it. Rather, they were a duplicant printed out of the aptly named printing pod using genetic ooze. The same goes if we click on this ration box that came with 20 kilos worth of nutrient bars, and those 20 kilos of nutrient bars are providing us 16,000 calories. If we click on the nutrient bars and go over to its properties, notice it is also made out of genetic ooze. This doesn't really say much, but I wanted to highlight it just to show you the fact that, yes, they came out of the printing pod and were sort of 3D printed. Now, if we go to our database, you're going to see that there's a few entries on index, logs, investigations, emails, and all sorts of fun lore facts. And I highly invite you to read all of them, where you're going to learn more about things like duplicates, the printing pod, and why we're sitting on this wonderful planetoid. And unfortunately, I've been running my mouth for quite some time, so I'm going to stop this episode here. And yes, I know we haven't even unpaused. This first episode had a lot of sort of upfront explaining to do. The next episode, which I'm going to try to release in the same day, because I understand this one didn't give you everything you wanted, we'll go into our first few cycles with the duplicates. But I'm going to try to keep all of these episodes down to about 20 to 30 minutes, so that they're more easily consumed. As a reference for the series, we're going to be trying to go over every aspect of building your first colony, from the time that your dupes are printed out to the time that they land on their first planet out in the star map. I hope you're as excited about this series as I am, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about it and what you're hoping to gain out of it in the comments below. So until next time, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you soon.